Alrighty, folks, we are ready to get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us here. And hello to our online audience. Really excited for this event here today. And really excited to welcome you all here to DreamBank. So for those of you who maybe haven't attended in advance or aren't super familiar with DreamBank, we're a free community resource that is put on by American Family Insurance. And everything we do ladders up towards the inspiration and pursuit of dreams. American Family feels that communities are better and the future is brighter when people who are actively pursuing their dreams, and that's why DreamBank was created. It's an inspirational community destination and virtual experience that is dedicated to dreamers everywhere. Our offerings are designed to help you celebrate the dream journey, overcome obstacles, and to stay motivated. I'll be sure to drop a few links in the chat to highlight some of our upcoming programming and to give all of you folks a better idea of our offerings here in our space. But really excited to introduce our featured speaker today. But before we do that, I want to go ahead and hand it over to Wayne from the American Family Sustainable Land Management Team.
Hello, everybody. Wayne Rayfield, Land Management Administrator with American Family Insurance. Welcome here, as well as people here in person. One of my main functions at American Family is to support and drive our land management strategy. And within that strategy, one of our key elements to that is education and outreach. And that's why we're here today. We're reaching out to all you people here. Within that outreach, we have every spring and fall, we do a sustainable land management series of lunch and learns. There are four of them. This is the second in that series, and a special edition here at the DreamBank. So we're really excited to bring this to the people out in Zoom land today because we don't normally do it inside of AmFam, but this is going out to the public. So I'm really excited for that, and I'm really excited to introduce Tim Ripp with the Bruce Company. Come on up, Tim, and to start his talk on low maintenance landscapes.
Thank you, Wayne. Appreciate that. I think I don't need that actually. Just set that aside. Yes, thank you, everyone. I appreciate you joining us today. For those of us in person and those of us out in Zoom land, I appreciate you tuning in today, spending an hour of your day with us. I know it's a beautiful spring day, so I'm sure there's lots of other things you could be doing, so I appreciate you taking the time out and spending it here with us. I appreciate Andrew for inviting us into this amazing space, and also Wayne and American Family for inviting us down to give this little talk. So today, the topic of our conversation, and I like to think of it as a conversation, is low maintenance natural landscapes. That's kind of a broad topic, and in the time we've got, it's not going to be a master class on landscape architecture or landscape design necessarily, but we're going to hit some broad topics of what that means, what are some conventional ideas that we're working with, and how best to integrate more naturalized practices in our landscapes on a daily basis. Now, before we get started too, I want to acknowledge that not maybe everyone in the room, nor everyone out in Zoom land has, let's say, a yard per se. Let's say we have urban yards or suburban yards. Some folks might have a courtyard, might live in an apartment. I'm hoping that once we get through my talk today, I can at least inspire you, if you don't have a big green space, to do what you can, right? Even if you live in an apartment or a balcony, putting a few tomato plants on your balcony makes a difference. Putting a few potted plants out on your patio space makes a difference. We'll get into why later on, but I want to acknowledge those folks and understand that there's something in this for everyone, I hope, and if nothing else, hopefully you can pass it along, right? Share the knowledge with your friends, your family, your neighbors, your community. There's always community gardening. There's always a way to get involved in your community. I'm an older person from my community in Lodi, also chair of the Parks Committee. So there's another good example. We got lots of volunteerism that comes in and helps out. So there's lots of ways to get involved in this sort of topic. So we'll get started. Key points of today's discussion, just sort of a brief overview. We're going to talk a little bit about low maintenance. What does that mean? What are the conventions? What are some of the misconceptions? We're going to talk about what those conventions of cost versus natural landscapes, my all favorite time versus money quotient, which I discuss with clients on a regular basis, the price we pay, how that impacts us. Then we'll get into some design aspects of this, so some overarching design principles. We'll drill down to some landscape design principles, how that affects us, how we can impact that in our own yards. And then we'll talk about what it means to be a good steward and what it means to play these natural landscapes out into the larger community. So With no further ado, we'll get started. Low maintenance landscapes. I just like to throw a couple of slides up here to sort of illustrate some of the things you're going to be seeing in your neighborhoods very shortly. I hope spring's finally here. Low maintenance landscapes. So I've been a landscape design architect for about 28 years now. I also, as noted in the previous screen, am a hort educator with UW Extension with Sauk County. So I work with clients every day. Almost the first things out of their mouth after the hi, how are yous and the short walk around their yard is, I want low maintenance. So what does that mean? What does that really mean? It means different things to different people, right? I think if I polled 100 people, I might get slightly different answers, but generally what they're looking for is less pruning, less weeding, less watering, less work, less time invested. I think the overarching idea is that lawn care is just hard work. Can be, depends upon the approach you take. So let's talk about what low maintenance really means. Fortunately, or unfortunately, I should say, when you close your eyes and you think about the average American landscape, these are the things you're going to envision, right? Low maintenance, not so much. Although this is a pretty typical American home, at least in the Midwest. I like to point that out. I mean, obviously the desert Southwest is slightly different. They're almost forced to work with natives, right? Traditional lawns, as we've been sort of guided to accept this as our vernacular, are really highly manicured. Most of these types of spaces really are kind of lacking in biodiversity and ultimately are high maintenance. Shrubs like this, they don't grow like that normally, right? And so somebody's putting time and effort into shearing a shrub from its natural form and making it look and be something it's not. We'll get into why that's a problem later, but this is a convention, right? This is what people imagine, but this is maybe not best practices ultimately. Where's that come from? Well, we're in DreamBank, so there's some irony here, but the American dream, this whole front yard green carpet concept really started back 1950s, maybe a little sooner than that. And it was really a push by the Garden Clubs of America, the Golf Association, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, really wanted to push this idea that, you've heard the term, folks' homes are their castles, right? And so that really lends itself to this vernacular again, where this expansive green lawn out in front is really the epitome of landscapes in America. Well, we've sort of been sold a bill of goods because, again, these are high maintenance, require high inputs, and really ultimately doesn't lead to low maintenance. So maybe our American dream needs to shift a little. Maybe our concepts on what that really means need to start shifting. And I think over the past 10 years, there's been a pretty big environmental movement, and we're seeing more and more of this movement away from these expansive green lawns that just need lots of maintenance. Here we go. Societal misconceptions, right? Conventional lawns versus a more natural space. I always say this too. I have some clients that look at me, they've got a 5-acre property per se, or maybe if it's just an acre, and they love their lawnmower. They look at me and they say, well, yeah, I could get rid of all my grass, but that's my meditation. I get out there on a Saturday morning and I'll spend 2 hours mowing my lawn, and if that's your thing, I'm not going to take that away from you. I work with specialists at the University of Extension, turf specialists, that they'll help you achieve this if you want to, with low inputs of fertilizers and chemicals and those things, and you can have that. But the issue that we have is that's a lot of time and a lot of maintenance and a lot of inputs going into that. Personally, I'd rather be fishing. I'd rather be playing with my kids. I can think of about a dozen things that would take me away from this lawnmower. Now, on the flip side, when we get into natural environments, we look at a prairie meadows type of garden. People often look at that and they can't get their minds around it. Again, we've kind of been programmed to have a spatial relationship to our natural environment. And so we understand organization. We understand neat, clean, and tidy. This gets to be a little crazy, and that ties into this next slide. So here we are. What are the conceptions of this? Neat, clean, tidy, organized, people feel like, oh, that's really neat and clean and it's totally maintainable. It is maintainable, but it takes a lot of inputs to do that. On the flip side, the natural or more prairie meadow, people's general misconceptions are it's overly wild, it's overly messy. The difference in these two is the high economic impact. Essentially, we're creating an ecological desert for beneficial insects, for pollinators, wildlife. You've essentially created a desert between your wild spaces that is really difficult for most insects and pollinators to manage. Whereas this, huge biodiversity as far as insects, pollinators, wildlife, those sorts of things in a more natural landscape, apart from the water quality and other benefits you get. So the one thing to keep in mind when we're looking at these slides too is that turf grass in Wisconsin, at least, the blends that we get often have a lot of Kentucky bluegrass in them, and unfortunately that's not a native species. So we're trying to shift that misconception too. We're trying to shift that vernacular to be a more broad sort of use of turf grass in a different way. So let's bust a few myths with this, okay? The natural landscapes, people typically say, oh, they're unattractive, they're messy, they're hard to maintain. It's sort of true, sort of not true. The reality is that most property values go up when you have a more native landscape. Most developers charge a little more for a natural landscape versus a landscape that's just a flat, traditional turf grass lawn. It also ties into natural features, so natural wildlife corridors. I like to think of places like the Pheasant Branch Creek Conservatory, or we're fortunate in Madison, we've got a lot of parkways and a lot of green spaces that interconnect and tie our spaces together. We'll touch on that again in a minute. And again, the environmental benefits that come from having a more naturalized landscape, water quality, stormwater runoff, habitat, the benefits go on and on. So as we sort of discussed, these are some of the practices you're going to see in a typical conventional landscape, right? And so you've got inputs of lawn treatments, irrigation, cleanup. I bring up this irrigation slide, as our environment changes, we experience more severe changes and fluctuations in our climate. This last year or two has been a really good example of the extreme drought, at least Wisconsin has been going through. And you see these lawns going dormant. So without this irrigation, these lawns, whose root structure is really only about 6 to 8 inches deep, are turning brown. Now, when you find a natural environment, those don't go brown, right? Because the root structure is now a foot or two deep versus 4 to 6 inches deep. So there's advantages to that. All of these things really are not what I would consider low maintenance. And the inputs and the costs that are involved in them are almost never ending. And there's just a better way to do it. I always say when the folks ask me for low maintenance, I said, well, what's your time money quotient? We never have enough of either, right? So how do you want to invest your time? Do you want to spend it 2-3 hours on your lawnmower, or do you want to spend your time doing more enjoyable activities? Like I said, I like to go fishing, but these are just some interesting statistics I thought I would share. As of 2020, which is a few years ago, I think this number has gone up. I think most of these numbers have gone up in the past few years. And you got about 230 million Americans that own some sort of lawn equipment. I often joke with my clients that after we're done with your landscape plan for the average urban lawn, if you own a weed whip, we should be able to garage sale that baby. That's an hour of your time in your life that you don't need to spend in your yard if we plan and design your landscape properly. Create flowing bed lines. There's just practices and ways to do that. So talk about time invested on average, 384 hours. And now all of these statistics really equate to your average urban lawn. So someone that's an acre or less of lawn, multiply that, right? So if you've got a 3-acre property, all of these numbers go up. Now, if you're living in an apartment or courtyard, obviously these things go down, but we're talking about national average, right? So those folks in the desert Southwest aren't putting the same inputs we are here in the Midwest or on the East Coast. So it's just an impact, right? So this, again, doesn't exactly equate to low maintenance to me. So we want to talk about where we're investing our time and how we're approaching design and the applications to our lawns. really, it's all too much, right? You start thinking about it. I get number one request I get from almost all my clients is low maintenance. My number one response in jest, is get rid of all your grass. Now, it's not realistic for most average homeowners, right? Turf has its place. And my turf grass specialist in extension always cringe when I say that. But the way to look at it is if you've got a high traffic area, you've got kids and dogs and activities and you're kicking soccer balls and having fun in your yard, then yes, there's a place for turf grass, okay? There's better blends of turf grass on the market now. We just have to look to our neighbors to the north in Minnesota and the application of bee lawns and the use of pollinators. We've actually been done a disservice also in the green industry. As little as 20 years ago, much of our turf grass had clover mixed in with it. Clover has lots of benefits, and it's a native plant, it's nitrogen fixing, it allows our lawns not to turn brown in the summertime, it provides better root structure, provides better aeration. So actually a lot of seed manufacturers are actually going back to including some clover and things into the turf grass. But this gentleman I like to think of is not just totally passed out from mowing his lawn for 3 hours, he's actually grounding and envisioning what his landscape could really be without this lawnmower attached to his side. This is the other key point I really like to make when we talk about these things. I've been doing this long enough, and I really like to put it out there and be realistic with people. There's no such thing as no maintenance. It doesn't exist, right? No garden, no landscape, I don't care if it's your vegetable garden, your perennial garden, your turf grass, whatever it is no maintenance. So my recommendation is choose wisely. Determine what your needs are, and we can help you define what that looks like in a landscape, right? If you need a place to kick a soccer ball, we can do that. But let's minimize that and let's focalize our areas of attention as they need to be, right? So what if, right? What if we took some of those conventions and turned them on their head a little bit and incorporated a little bit more of a naturalized landscape into our things? And when I say naturalized landscapes, really the focus here is to use natives. Native plant material selection is really huge, and we'll get into that a little bit. I don't have lists and lists upon lists of native plants for you to choose and put in your yard. I do have resources at the end of this talk in the slides that refer you to some really excellent sources to find plant lists and so on and so forth. But we really want to start changing that vernacular, and I think some of it is. How do we do that, and what does that mean? So natural landscapes, we can take those wild spaces, and if we create intention and we create organization, we find a happy medium. We find a place where we can create beneficial spaces for insects and pollinators, and we can still create areas of turf grass for those higher activity, higher impact activities. Balance. It's all about balance. So we're going to talk a little bit about design. You'll notice this says 5 fundamental principles of design. I like to start here. This is a landscape plan, obviously, but these 5 fundamentals of design are really a creative expression, right? So they apply to landscape, as we're going to be talking about today, but they also apply to a really intricate quilt, right? You can apply this to paintings, you can apply this to sculpture. The idea here is to get you thinking on a high level about how to organize space and how to start thinking about your space differently. So 5 main aspects of these principles are unity and harmony, balance and proportion, rhythm and repetition, creating emphasis or focal points, and then really refinement, keeping it simple. Editing is huge. I have a lot of clients that have great intentions and are wonderful people, wonderful gardeners, want the best for their environment, want the best for their yards. They go to the farmer's market down here on the square on a Saturday morning. They pick up some of their favorite plants, and they come home and they do what I call the dandelion effect, which is they take all these wonderful plants they've got and they go, and whatever space they fall into the yard is where they end up. So having some intentionality and some direction to where we're putting those plants is really huge. So we're going to breeze through this a little bit. Unity and harmony, I like to think of this a different way. This is really, there's a space for everything and everything in its space. I think one of the biggest hurdles we jump in the landscape industry is wrong plant, wrong spot. So if we think about it this way and think about how our elements are tying together, whether it's a hardscape space like a patio, whether it's a water feature, whether it's our plantings, whether it's turf grass, Finding a way to make all of those spaces relate and make sense to each other is really the overarching goal, right? And we do that several different ways by incorporating these other elements. Balance and proportion. So balance really talks about weighing your space. Now, not every space has to be bisymmetrically balanced where everything, you're balancing the teeter-totter, right? It's really about visual references and creating a space that one side doesn't overpower another side. So it doesn't mean we have to have same, matchy on both sides. It just means we need to create a space that feels like it belongs together. And then the proportion comes in as scale, right? We want to think about the scale of the things that we're using, whether it's plant materials or structures or hardscapes, and how those tie into the larger space. So this is a really important aspect to keep in mind. And now, again, I'm not going to read everything verbatim. The slides are here. The recordings will be available if you want to go back and read all these notes, but these are the high points. Another aspect that we use in these overarching design principles is rhythm and repetition. So I like to think of this as not every space needs to be a brand new space. So if I come to a homeowner's yard and I'm going to do a landscape design for them, the front yard should not be a whole new space from the backyard. Your mind wants to create this gestaltism, right? Little elements create a whole. And so we do that. We can do that several different ways. You can do it with color. You can do it with plant texture. But creating a rhythm, creating a repetition really is what allows your brain to connect all the dots and make those spaces really feel like they flow together. And so there's different ways to do that. But color, texture, movement is a really big thing to keep in mind. Emphasis and focal points. So these are all elements that go into putting your plan together. Emphasis and focal. So you wanna. Not every space wants to be a brand new space, but not every space has to be the jewel of your space either. So if we want to create a focal point, like a statue or a water feature or some amazing specimen plant, we can do that. And we do that by directing your eye. We can do that with shapes and forms and pathways. You can also do it with color. People often overlook that. So calm colors, whites, blues, soft pinks, will cause your eye to pause, right? Like these blues here. Cause your eye to pause, where vibrant colors, reds, oranges, yellows, really pull you into a space. And so we find a balance there, but we're really intentionally laying these things out to guide you through the landscape. And again, editing, simplicity. This is obviously not a landscape I created, but it just is a reminder that more is not better. Sometimes you can take 5 plants and repeat them in such a way throughout a landscape that it's more impactful than having 105 plants. So it's really about that. It's really about reminding yourself to go back and edit and to really think again about that intentionality of how you're using the space, what plants are going into those spaces to avoid that overall arching sort of dandelion effect that we get. Oftentimes with those folks that come home with these great plants and they cast them everywhere. Well, fortunately, if you call me, we can come in and I can take an inventory of what you've got and we can reorganize. Because a lot of times it's just about the organization. So those are our general design principles, right? And they can apply to just about anything you're designing. So we'll drill into more landscape design and how we're tying these natural spaces together. Again, this isn't everybody's ideal, right? This still feels like a lot of work to people. But I'll tell you what, this garden, I think the average person would touch that 3 times a year. Spring cleanup, some management in the summer, maybe fall cleanup. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Your lawn, your turf grass, on a good year with good moisture, half an inch or more a week, you're mowing that maybe once a week. At worst, every 2 weeks. Think about the time invested with that. This, once established, now keep in mind, and I'm not going to sell you a bill of goods, to create a garden space like this could take 3 years of management. But once it's created, once it's established, once it's set, it's a little bit hands off. It's kind of survival of the fittest at that point, and your job is simply to just be a steward of that space. So here are some overarching design principles, landscape design principles. These are the ones that we really focus on when we're putting your landscape together. Creating that connectivity, using plant diversity, layer planting, thinking about the greater whole in the natural environment. We want to think about habitat, shelter, nesting sites. Everybody's heard about it now. The push for pollinators is a big thing. Pollinator decline, bird decline is the numbers are astronomical. And a big part of what I do with Extension is work on pollinator education. And so we definitely want to not ignore that. You create these landscapes. It's sort of a field of dreams. We're in the dream state again. If you build it, they will come. You'd be amazed at how fast you can take a home that was just built in an old cornfield, incorporate native plants, incorporate the right flowering things, and how fast biodiversity comes back into that space. A year, 2, most. It's amazing. So these are the things we're going to talk about. This one, I put this slide first, but really it could have been last. This is really the overarching idea of everything, right? Connectivity. So here's your space, and this is what I talked about before I started even the slides. I don't care if you've got a little urban backyard, you've got a big suburban yard, or you've got a little courtyard. Anything you do in that space provides connectivity. We're connecting to the greater landscape as a whole. So every little bit you do makes a difference. It creates corridors. It creates connectivity between these green spaces. Again, we're really fortunate to live where we do. You know, there might be other areas of the country, and I'm not going to knock any cities, but Madison is fantastic for the attention that we spend to our natural spaces and how we have these pockets and these corridors, these pocket parks. I'll bring up the Pheasant Branch Creek Conservatory again as a wonderful example of how to really bring these corridors back to a more urban landscape and allow people, invite people in and allow people to really appreciate that. So connectivity is huge. Next most important thing is really plant diversity. So, and by this I mean natives, and more natives. Or as my friend Lisa Johnson, who is an extension specialist here in Dane County, would say, nativars work too. And a nativar is essentially a cultivar of a native, right? So we may not want a solidago or a goldenrod that's 6 feet tall. Well, guess what? I can give you one that's now 2 feet tall. Come down to the garden center, check us out. We got lots of good stuff like that, but nativars also work. But what we really want to do, and the focus on natives, is really about bringing in the right sort of pollinators, the right sort of wildlife, and the right sort of management practices, because these natives are really, they're adapted to be here, right? They were here before we were. Now we're just using them to organize them within our space. Another aspect we definitely want to consider when we're putting our landscape plans together is plant layering. So plant layering and plant diversity kind of go hand in hand. We want a wide variety of plant material within the landscape so that we're supporting, again, a wide variety of pollinators and beneficial insects and wildlife. And if you do your layering right, we want to start, taller to smaller. You want to consider every level of your landscape. A lot of times when I talk about landscapes with people, they think flowers. They automatically think flowers. Well, don't overlook the evergreens for shelter and habitat. Don't overlook the flowering shrubs that may provide some pollen and nectar sources in the spring, but those flowering shrubs also produce berries that the birds will pick off later in the fall, in the winter. So layering your plants is big, and you want to create different levels, which also creates a different microclimates, which again supports different types of pollinators and beneficial insects. So if you're creating that layered environment, this just comes by default. I thought about it after the fact. Habitat diversity just happens, right? You create those layering effect, and you're going to create that habitat diversity. But really intentionally, if you can incorporate meadows. So I often get asked when I'm giving this talk, well, I want to get rid of all my turf grass, and I can't eliminate all of it. Don't have to. Start small, right? Start with a 10 by 10 space in your yard. If you take that, even that little pocket of your yard, it makes an impact. And so creating a habitat diversity, we want to, I rail on turf grass, and again, it's a place for everything and everything in its place. What we want to avoid is monocultures, and turf grass is essentially a monoculture, and there's lots of reasons for that. I'll just throw ash trees out there for an example, or elm trees. If we plant too much of one thing, they're highly susceptible to being hit with certain insects, certain bugs, certain fungal diseases, and that has detrimental impacts on a huge economic scale, which we're experiencing right now, especially with ash trees. But habitat diversity is huge. If you can get some water features in there, that's fantastic. So that, again, layering, habitat diversity naturally ties into doing this, right? But this should be an intentional thought in your overall plan. If you have the space, some people say, oh, I just don't have the space. Well, if we plan right, you do, right? If we organize your space right, we can find a space. I can find a space for almost any one of these things within a graded landscape. But again, our goal here is to support pollinators, beneficial. And I keep hitting on that. Why am I hitting on that? So there's something called best management practices or integrated pest management. And if we want to talk about low maintenance, we really want to talk about lowering our economic inputs into the space. So lowering our fertilizers, lowering our fungicides, lowering our herbicides, lowering the need for all of these chemical impacts that we're not only spending time and money on, but we're also putting into an environment that might have some detrimental effects. So if we really work on incorporating some of these other aspects, native plants, do the layering right, place for everything in its place, we're doing that naturally. Right? We're inviting those beneficial insects back in that help us. Seasonal interest is a big thing. It's right up there with everything else. People want year-round interest. And a goal is always to have something always in bloom, if possible. Now, here's where I get pushback a lot of times is when we get into this, right? And that's where I said we might touch a certain gardens maybe only 3 times a year. And I said that fall cleanup is kind of, well, we'll talk about that a little bit. This is beautiful. You get a spring, you get your fall. Summertime, we have different perennials blooming. Then we get to winter and people want to come on and just cut all that down. Well, think of the interest we're getting out of that. Think of the grasses and the plants. It's amazing. This with some hoarfrost on it on a beautiful sunny December morning is stellar, spectacular. Right? So there's definitely landscape interest, there's landscape value to this from just a purely visual aesthetic standpoint. Not to mention that all of these plants provide shelter, provide food, provide habitat for pollinators and other beneficial insects all winter long. We take all that away and we're essentially created Siberia. Who wants to look at a barren wasteland for Wisconsin? Could be 6 months of the year. This winter didn't count, by the way. I think this year we really had an exceptionally long fall with a few scattered snow events. But so what does this mean? So native plant selection, before I get into that exactly, all of these other principles, I like to sort of put it this way sometimes is if you take a coloring book, I got kids, so lots of coloring books around my house. Take that coloring book out and you take that coloring book page that has no color on it, right? We've taken all these design principles and all these concepts, and that is what has defined what is on the page, right? That's our pencil to paper. That's what's defined that. So where does our color palette come in and our selection come in? Our native plants, right? That's where we start coloring in the lines, right? I never approach a landscape from, geez, I got to put a lilac in your yard. I know you love lilacs. Where can I put? It's always size, form, function. And these principles that we've talked about guide that. Size, form, function, and the framework of the overall landscape. Then we can start filling in the goals. I know in a certain spot in your landscape, I want a shrub that's 4 foot tall by 4 foot wide, beautiful spring flowers, great fall color, has benefits for wildlife and pollinators. That's a viburnum, that's a chokeberry. That I could name 5 different things that fill those roles. So if we focus on a size, form, function, and are working with roles that we're trying to fulfill in a larger landscape, then our palette opens up enormously. And we've got so many native plants that we can start coloring in those lines. So if your favorite color is blue and yellows, great, we can do that. I have some clients that look at me and say, I don't want any orange. Well, if I would have approached it from I have to put a butterfly weed in your yard, well, that eliminates that because it's orange, right? So we need to approach it a little differently. But native plant selection is huge. Again, I'm not going to give you a list of things, but in my references, there's lots of good resources for finding native plant selection, both with UW Extension, horticulture. If you go onto that website and touch on that pollinator tab, more information than you can probably use in a lifetime. So the one thing that we don't want to forget, though, and what makes all of this make sense is to humanize it, right? So sometimes we think conventional mode, super neat, super manicured is a convention, but really it's about context and it's about putting it in a way, an organization that makes sense, and drawing people in and allowing people to understand that the wild is wild, but it's intentional, right? I like to think about it this way too. I take a cue. I'm only about one generation off the farm. And when I say farm, I mean pre 1950s farm, where it was a self-sustaining farm where you grew the food for your family, right? But one thing I've always respected about farmers and agriculture is their lands can be as wild and crazy as anything, but if they intentionally mow the edges, your vernacular automatically changes. It creates an organized space in your mind that your mind can process and comprehend. So we're doing that a little differently, but we don't want to forget that human element and bringing in things that draw people in. Oftentimes, something as simple as signage is great. Now, you don't want a yard full of signs, but it does help sometimes. So those are, where we come from with design and how we approach those things. Now we're going to get into what are the impacts of conventional versus sort of a more naturalized landscape and what that really means, and what's our role, right? I like to remind myself as well as clients and people I work with that yes, your home may be your castle, but it's only yours for a finite amount of time, right? We are essentially stewards. The land will carry on after we're gone. So what are we doing to it in the meantime, right? So really, what are those conventional impacts having not only on the land, but also to our just neighborly environment? So here we are again, right? Leaf blowers, weed whips, filling things up. Again, these stats are a few years old, but the Wildlife Federation, 18% of municipal solid waste is collected and sent to the landfill. I think I read recently that between organic lawn waste and organic household waste that gets shipped to the landfills now at about 25%, which is huge. What happens to that? It gets buried. What happens to that? It becomes an anaerobic situation. What happens to that? It becomes methane. What happens to that? Methane escapes and feeds our greenhouse gases and causes issues, right? Now, again, we happen to live in a part of the nation where we've got great resources. Madison is heads and bounds above a lot of other communities in the sense that we have great yard and compost collection sites all over. So there's always a place you can take this that doesn't go to the landfill. I just want you to be aware of that, because sometimes this is the easy route, right? Go buy a bag, throw it at the curb, let somebody else worry about it. But where does it go? Just sucking up your leaves, blowing them. I mean, it's just time money quotient. Do we need this? Do we need to do this? Not necessarily. Here's just some more interesting facts. This is really mostly about noise pollution. The point here is really lawnmowers, leaf blowers, weed whackers, hedge trimmers. If you look at the decibel ratings of all these things that you're getting, somewhere between 90 and 100 decibels of sound, anything over 85 is harmful to human hearing, right? So that neighbor that's next door while you're on your patio having a nice lunch with your family that only has that day or that hour to mow his lawn or do his weed whipping and that's what they're doing. They can't help it, right? But again, if we shift our convention to a more naturalized landscape, we may not make this all go away, but we can reduce it. If we can even reduce it by half, think about the impacts we're having on that. We just had an eclipse, right? What was one of the biggest things people were talking about with the eclipse? What happens when it gets quiet? What happens with all the animals and the insects, right? Think about the impact this has on insects, pollinators, wildlife, let alone your own state of mind when you're just trying to be outdoors. So goal here is to eliminate as much of this as possible. It also, ties into our green impact, our global impact, your carbon footprint, if you will. Any way that we can reduce some of this is for the benefit, right? So again, if we follow some of those principles earlier, we can do that. We can achieve that. Big push, as I said, environmental movement's really gaining ground, and there's a lot of different ways to look at it. One big push we've got is called Leave the Leaves. Maybe some of you have heard that term. Another big push is moving towards bee lawns, which I understand you're going to have another event coming up that I'd like to tune you into is with Phil Leash, or PJ Leash, sorry. He's our our entomology specialist with UW Extension. And one thing he's going to talk about is no mow May and what's the deal with no mow May. And that ties into this, right? There's just better ways to do it. These leaves don't, again, 50s convention. My dad loves his golf course lawn. We argue about it all the time. These leaves don't ever have to leave your property. Never. You can create compost bins. You can create other spaces. Buy a mulching mower. If we're going to mow anyways, mulch this. Add those organics back in. What happens when you add these organics back into your lawn? Less inputs. Less inputs with nitrogen, with fertilizers, with all of those things in the future. You're creating a healthier space. A lot of times when we run into lawns in our business that are suffering and struggling, our number one go-to is adding compost, believe it or not. It's not fertilizers. It's not adding more chemical inputs. It's adding compost, adding soil and compost and the nutrients that are involved in that, and the micronutrients that are involved in that, even over an existing lawn, has huge impacts. So think about it differently. Step away from the rake, leave the leaves. If you have a space in your yard to pile those or create a space or compost them, great. You've got a garden space that you can bring those leaves in, use them. They work great for mulch. They're weed suppressants, okay? There's lots of things to do rather than bagging them up and shipping them off to the landfill. Here you go. Simple. Pallets are available. Dime a dozen. Find them just about anywhere. This could be really simple. Oh, it's unsightly. Oh, it's messy. It doesn't have to be. I can plant bushes around this and make this look fantastic, right? And think about what you're doing too. You're taking all that garden scrap waste, you're taking all your organic food waste, and you're creating black gold. I say our number one go-to for some of these lawn repairs and some of these high stress areas is compost. Compost isn't free, right? Unless you do it in your backyard, right? You hire a company like ours and we're bringing it to you, we're spreading, we're happy to do it. It will definitely create benefits, but there's cost to that. But you can do this in your backyard. It takes a little time to get started, but once it's started, the process doesn't stop. It just keeps going. So it's just a really good thing to think about. So benefits that we talked about, some of them, reduce your fall preparation. So this goes back to the fall cleanup thing again. I guess I sort of forgot this slide was in here. People ask me about fall cleanup all the time, and I say, why bother? Why bother? Again, I've got better things to do. That time of year, fall, there's so many activities going on that we don't need to be out in our garden. Let it be. These winterberry, or could be viburnum, berries that are left, the birds will eat those all winter long. In fact, some berries need to go through this freeze-thaw cycle to ripen to a point where the birds want them. Again, within habitat and interest, there are cavity nesting pollinators that need these spaces. They need these grasses to overwinter and to raise their young for the next generation. Pollinators. So I'm a beekeeper. I love my honeybees, but I will tell you they are this big in the world of pollinators that we work with in Wisconsin. There's 500 species of bees alone in Wisconsin. Many of them are cavity nesters or ground nesters. So by removing this from your landscape, you are declining that population, maybe more so than we can even really count because it's hard to keep track of that. But again, I go back to winter interest, right? So if we pick the right plants, we pick the right things, your landscape can look fantastic all year long. So I like to bring us back to this again. We're getting close to the end now, but where do we want to put our time? Where do we want to put our money? This is, again, not low maintenance, but this is the convention people think of when they think of low maintenance. And having to run irrigation in our droughty seasons, whereas if you went to something like a bee lawn, which was developed by the University of Minnesota, the clover, the nitrogen, the things that go into this, your lawn will never go dormant again. And you don't need this irrigation. I won't get started on that. Everybody, social constructs with a weed-free lawn. Some weeds are beneficial. I mentioned the no mow May. Look into that. I encourage you to look into that on your own, or pay attention to the upcoming presentation here. University of Wisconsin Extension, we recently did a webinar also on it. So lots of information out there, but the idea about leaving some weeds in your lawn, especially early in the season for pollinators, is really critical. Okay, pollinators coming out of hibernation are starving, and if we're going out there and we're mowing everything out of our lawn and everything out of our landscape because we think they're weeds, we're doing a disservice to the greater environment. So maybe a little less of those conventions. Maybe we take our design principles, we take the knowledge that we've got about how we can benefit the landscape, and we do a little bit more of this, right? It looks busy. It looks like a lot of work. I roll a plan out in front of clients and they say, oh, it's so much. And I just say, trust me, this is a lot less work in the long run than your lawn will be for the next 20 years you're living where you're living. Guarantee it. Besides that, think of the diversity. Think of the interest. Think of the amazing. Would I rather sit in the middle of a football field or sit under an arch on a hillside with a bunch of daffodils this time of year? Look around the parks. I think you get your answer. There's a lot more people out in the parks than there are out on unless you're playing soccer, out on a soccer field. So just to summarize, overarching advantages to low maintenance versus natural. A lot of this, again, is all about planning. I've had mentors in my day that really planning is the key to success, right? That's the first step. What do you get out of that? You reduce your long-term maintenance, you reduce your costs, your time money quotient changes, hopefully to your benefit. So you can take more of your time and your energy and your money and invest it elsewhere, doing fun activities, experiences, and frees up time for other activities. Okay. Natural landscapes, again, promote the use of native plant materials. Again, I can't express again how critical that is. Native plant selection makes all the difference. And we've got great nurseries around, ours included. We've got lots of specialists that are there to help you. If you need help, you need guidance, come on in, talk to us. We've got lots of experts that can help you pick the right plant for the right space. We're also working on creating habitat, pollinators, beneficial insects. We're increasing the overall biodiversity, which again increases stormwater management, soil aeration, soil building, all those good things. Reduces our carbon footprint if we can get away from using some of those gas-powered trimmers. Now, there's been some advances in electric-powered mowers, trimmers, all those things. That's great. That's great, but they still have an impact, and it still may not be leading us to the natural landscape that we want to work with. Overall, we really want to remember and don't lose sight of the stewardship aspect of what we're doing, right? These spaces are only ours for a short amount of time. So how do we do that, and what do we leave for the next person? This is a great quote I always like. So we've got some amazing resources, and this environmental movement keeps growing. So places like the Wild Ones, the Xerxes Society, UW Extension, University of Minnesota Extension, the work that's being done around these natural landscapes and pushing this new convention is astronomical, and the impacts overall can be seen. So like I said, I've got a bunch of resources on here. I'm not going to read through all these, but hopefully you'll get the handouts that we've got here or the recordings, and you can look up some of these things. But the ones I really want to push again are the Xerxes Society. Check us out at UW Extension. Or if you like that one-on-one in-person contact, come down to the Bruce Company. Come and talk to our experts in the Garden Center. We've got a lot of knowledgeable people that are really ready to help you out. Here's some great books on just plant ID. So the other thing I get that I didn't touch on is I'll show up to a yard with a client and they don't know. I'm sorry, I don't know what I've got in my yard. I don't know what's good or what's bad. And I look at them, I say, what do you do for a living? They say, I'm an accountant. I said, good, I need my taxes done. It's not what I do. This is why you called me. So, but here are some good guides and some good resources. You can go in and really identify what's going on, what's beneficial, what's a weed, what's not weed. I hate that term. I really hate the term weed, actually, because a weed could be anything you choose not to have in your yard, right? Like if you hate roses, roses are a weed to you, right? So let's clarify that a little bit. But additional online resources for you here. And that's really the summation of what I've got for you today. Do I have any immediate questions?
In the audience here, before we go ahead, or online questions, before we go ahead and go online though, are there any questions for the folks who are in the room? Give me 1 second, run the mic.
So you talked a lot about rhythm and repetition
Yeah.
when considering natural landscapes, specifically groupings and colors. Can you provide an example of like what your thought process would be and how to incorporate some of that grouping and colors to provide that rhythm and repetition?
Sure. Again, not every space needs to be a brand new space. So again, so I sort of touched on it briefly. Color has huge impacts in the landscape. You may not consciously digest that, but your mind does, right? So there's always a push-pull in an environment, right? And so reds, oranges, hot colors, warm colors are going to pull you through an environment, right? Cooler colors, blues, whites, soft yellows, soft pinks are going to cause you to slow down and pause, right? So that's using color, but you can also use texture, right? Finer texture versus coarser texture has a similar effect. Now, when you mix the two, it creates an even bigger impact. It's sort of like a compound impact, right? So finer textures actually tend to speed you up, and coarser textures tend to slow you down. So when we talk about layering and the habitat thing, that's a big component of that. So we usually want coarser textures to the back and finer textures at the front, and we think about our layering that way. But it doesn't always have to be that way, right? If you're moving through a landscape and I create a little hidden woodland garden where I want people to pause or to gather, I might use a surround of, just trying to think of sort of, hosses aren't natives. So hosses aren't natives. You use a wider texture plant, right? It's escaping me right now what I would maybe suggest for that right off the top of my head. But it causes you to pause. It causes you to stay in the space. So it is a big component of it.
We got a question from Tammy online here. Are extension staff or Bruce company staff available to come to my home and help brainstorm and design native spaces to decrease grass? Can you get rid of grass in very shady areas?
So with extension, no. Extension, I always like to say, doesn't make house calls. So that's where professionals like myself come in. That's why I kind of live in both worlds here. I love sharing and disseminating information. That's where the extension part comes in. But I learned in my 28 years of experience being a designer that after about a decade or so, I found myself one day going, what am I doing? I'm really educating, right? Like I really try to take that approach with clients too. So if you want somebody to come out and talk to you and really educate you about what's going on in your lawn and what's going on in your space, then call a professional, right? I had a recent question. Do I need to have a professional come out to help me? No, we've got resources that, simple pollinator planting gardens and things you can follow. We've got those coloring books available to you. But you have to remember, while we use similar conventions and we use similar plants, every space is still unique and still has its own attributes and its unique spaces within it. We use plants and things to create different microclimates, but every lawn or yard naturally has that: sun, shade, moisture levels, all those things. So it really helps to have a professional come out and help you kind of analyze what works best in any space. Can these spaces be done in shady spaces? Absolutely. Sunny, shaded, light requirements really make no difference. That goes back to our native plant selection, right? We've got plants that do everything. They're amazing. It's a beautiful thing. The thing I love most about what we do for a living actually is you can design, let's say we designed a quilt, right? The quilt gets hung on your wall and stays static forever, right? This is constantly growing and changing. Every day the garden is different, just a little bit different, right? Every season it's a little bit different. And that's what's great about it. And so that dynamic that we get out of it is really where the energy comes in.
Thanks for that. Next question from Wisconsin women entrepreneurs. I seem to have trouble growing some things, and I wonder if the soil has nutrients in it or is nutrient rich. I've added manure and compost, probably not enough, question mark, but I feel like it has a lot of clay and can't grow plants well. Is there a way to get it analyzed and get some recommendations to improve the soil for better plant maintenance?
Yes. Yes, that's a big resource with UW Extension is getting your soil tested. I believe it's $25 to have a test done. So any extension office, we've got extension offices in almost every county. You call them up, they can ship you a bag. Actually, there's an online, if you go to the Turf Diagnostic Lab with UW Extension, just put in your Google box, UW Turf Diagnostics Lab. There's actually an online spot to request soil sample bags. That gets sent into our turf specialist, Paul Cook, and his team, and they will send you back a detailed analysis of what's going on in your yard, what the impacts might be, what your nutrient loads are. The one thing we like to encourage you to think about, and there's directions on how to do all this online, or if you talk to an extension specialist, they can guide you. But the trick to it is not to just take one sample from one spot in your yard. You want to take the areas of interest for sure, but by sampling multiple places in your yard, you're getting a holistic view of what's going on there. So don't be discouraged by clay either, okay? That's where we go back to natives and we go back to native perennials, native grasses, all those things. Those plants, turf grass, root structure is 4 to 6 inches, okay? Natural, native, ornamental, or grasses, we call them ornamental grasses sometimes, the root structure can be 2 feet or more, right? So that's clay busted, and that's increasing your soil quality overall. So
Thanks for that. This question has come up a couple times about the event in and of itself. This event is being recorded, and once the recording is posted, it will be shared with the email address in which you used to register, and I will also send out the slide deck and the list of resources that Tim provided. I think we have a question here in the in-person audience.
So if I have a grass lawn and I want to make that first step to convert it into a natural meadow, prairie, anything else, what would you do to reduce that turf or get rid of it so that we don't have that seed bed in the seed bed anymore? What's your first step?
planning. First step of all things is planning. So define that space. Determine really what your intention is with that space. Seed bank, yes. So turf grass, really the way we manicure it, the way we manage it, I should say, not a lot of seed bank there, honestly. What happens when we roll the sod away, get rid of that grass, the seed bank that's there sometimes can, and that's why I say these spaces are wonderful and very low maintenance, but it does take, usually it's year 3. 3 is the magic number with these things. So you're going to have a few more inputs, year 1, 2, till you get to 3 when these things really start to fill in the space, and the natives themselves will crowd out any invasive species quite often. So there's multiple ways to handle that. You can come in and simply just strip your turf, whatever area you want, hire a professional. I would say sometimes gardening is great, and if you want to get your hands dirty, I love do-it-yourselfers, but think about, again, your time-money quotient. And think about the labor-intensive nature of some of these things to get started, right? And if you can have a professional help you get over that hill and set you up for success, then the rest of it's kind of gravy and a lot more fun. Black plastic works great if you want to kill off an area. Simply removing the soil. What we don't typically recommend is going out with chemicals and sort of spraying it dead, right? Does it work? Yes. The problem that we have with that is more is not better. And oftentimes people feel like, well, if I do just this little bit, it'd be great. But if I do that much more, it's going to work faster. It doesn't work that way. And so the environmental impacts of that are greater than what your end goal is, right? So, and sometimes it's not even the immediate impacts, it's the drift that it has to other places and other insects that you may not consciously be thinking of. So I would say strip it, cover it, smother it, cardboard, black plastic, all those things in. And so that's where your planning comes back in, because you can't do that overnight, right? That's not going to happen in 24 hours. You got to think, and oftentimes I say start in the fall, because in the fall, things are dying back, absorbing things into the root. So if you cut off those nutrients at that point, you're starving them. And so starving them over winter or for a period of time is really set you up for your best success.
We've got time for one more question.
Great.
So this one's from Adriana online. How do you plan to control critters who love this natural habitat but who might also cause trouble? We have chipmunks who dig big holes around our foundation and who destroy our vegetable garden every year. Pest control advised to clear all shrubs around our perimeter, perimeter, so that they don't feel safe having hiding spots. Thoughts on that, Tim?
Yeah, don't do that. I get these questions all the time. Okay, no garden is no maintenance. We'll go back to that. If you have problem areas, a big part of what I do for a living, and maybe it's good to have a professional out, right? We solve problems. So whether it's drainage problems, pest problems, if I had the cure for rabbits and deer, I'd be the richest person you've ever met in my life. Moles, rabbits, and deer. We can't eliminate them. Sometimes groundhogs too. Groundhogs, you'd be surprised, can do some serious damage. Chipmunks, a little minor, but find the problem area and address it. So if you've got a place where they're burrowing or they have a spot they can get into your home, cover it, close it off. One of the biggest, and I didn't put a slide in here, one of the biggest misconceptions, in my opinion, in the landscape industry as a whole is that gravel mulch equals low maintenance. And so you see people just dump gravel around their foundation everywhere. It's really not. If you really think about what you're doing there, you're creating this layered effect. So you're taking the natural soils where we want to add organics and things back into and improve the soil conditions. You're covering it with fabric, which we do now. Years ago, they used to cover it with plastic, which created anaerobic situations, really negative. You're putting gravel on that. Then what happens with all that leaf litter, all that weed debris, all the airborne dust and dirt? We live in an urban environment, but we're only 10 minutes from very rural areas. Okay, and what happens when all those rural areas are harvesting or working their agricultural fields? All of that dust debris, all those weed seeds get blown up into the air and they filter back into your yard and they end up in these gravel beds. People do that because they think it reduces critters and things like that. It really doesn't. So find the problem areas and address them. If you've got a garden, a vegetable garden, you want to keep the critters out of it, fence it. If you've got a hole in the foundation, plug it. Or talk to a wildlife specialist that can help you with that. David Drake at the university is an amazing guy. If you want a wildlife specialist to come out and talk to you about groundhog problems or any other wildlife problems you've got going on, you look up David Drake at the University of Wisconsin. He's an amazing guy. So we can't avoid those things, right? But our idea here is if we design this right and we create these environments, there's space for everything, right? We don't necessarily want to eliminate them. We want to give them a place to go, just intentionally.
Thanks so much for that. And so I think a great place to conclude there. I want to thank everyone for taking time out of their day to join us here, whether it be in person or virtual. I want to thank the American Family Insurance Sustainable Land Management team in partnership with this event, as well as the Bruce Company as well. If you're curious about more of our upcoming events and offerings, you can go to our website, which is amfam.com/DreamBank, and get a good, concise list of everything that we have coming up. With that being said, we will go ahead and cap it there, and we will see you all next time. Take care.